All right, guys. So this story here probably should have come out decades ago, but we just got verification actually this week. So it turns out that there's this story that's been told throughout history since Reagan was president, and this is like the in the right wing bubble argument. They say Ronald Reagan was such a strong and tough president that the second he got into office, the Iranians said, "Oh, we're so scared. Now let's release these American hostages that we were just holding." So, there was this Iran hostage crisis, and Jimmy Carter and his administration were working day and night, quite literally, trying to negotiate their release. And right after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, Iran released the hostages. Now, again, in the right-wing world, they say, well, that's because Ronald Reagan did peace through strength. And so the Iranians knew, if we don't release him now, Reagan's going to attack us and we're toast. And that's why they released them. Well, now we have a Ronald Reagan administration insider who's coming out and admitting, actually, that's not true. Iran was going to release the hostages earlier, and then the Reagan campaign reached out to Iran through a back channel and said, don't release them. Don't release them, because then Jimmy Carter might win. Don't release them. And then as soon as I get in, you can release them. And we'll give you an even better deal. Wow. Now, by the way, why is this coming out now? Because there's a guy who was involved who has a guilty conscience. And Jimmy Carter is now in hospice care, which means he's going to die very shortly. And he wanted to clear the record. And it's almost kind of like a mea culpa to Jimmy Carter to be like, hey, man, sorry about that. But you totally got screwed. You got cheated. And Reagan kind of committed treason in the process. So, as in the New York Times, a 4-decade secret, one-man story of sabotaging Carter's reelection. A prominent Texas politician said he unwittingly took part in a 1980 tour of the Middle East with a clandestine agenda. It has been more than 4 decades, but Ben Barnes said he remembers it vividly. His longtime political mentor invited him on a mission to the Middle East. What Mr. Barnes said he did not realize until later was the real purpose of the mission: to sabotage the reelection campaign of the President of the United States. It was 1980 and Jimmy Carter was in the White House, bedeviled by a hostage crisis in Iran that had paralyzed his presidency and hampered his effort to win a second term. Mr. Carter's best chance for victory was to free the 52 Americans held captive before Election Day. There was something that Mr. Barnes said his mentor was determined to prevent. That was something that Mr. Barnes said his mentor was determined to prevent. His mentor was John B. Connally Jr., a titan of American politics and former Texas governor who had served 3 presidents and just lost his own bid for the White House. A former Democrat, Mr. Connally, had sought the Republican nomination in 1980. That was when Republicans embraced the Southern strategy and got more racist. This guy switched to continue to be racist. That's not like an exaggeration. That's not hyperbole. Connally had sought the Republican nomination in 1980 only to be swamped by former Governor Ronald Reagan of California. Now, this is the key part, Mr. Connally resolved to help Mr. Reagan beat Mr. Carter, and in the process, Mr. Barnes said, make his own case for becoming Secretary of State or Defense in a new administration. So, do you understand all the pieces coming together? The pieces here are, this guy wanted to be president, lost the primary to Reagan. So his way of sucking up to Reagan was to do his dirty work for him, do a tour of the Middle East, get the back channel to Iran, and convince Iran, hey, hold on to the hostages until Reagan is elected, and then if you achieve that, Reagan will, pay you back by giving you a position in the administration. This is astonishing, man. This is how politics really works. This is some Game of Thrones stuff. What happened next, Mr. Barnes has largely kept secret for nearly 43 years. Mr. Connally, he said, took him to one Middle Eastern capital after another that summer, meeting with a host of regional leaders to deliver a blunt message to be passed to Iran. Don't release the hostages before the election. Mr. Reagan will win and give you a better deal. Then shortly after returning home, Mr. Barnes said Mr. Connally reported to William J. Casey, the chairman of Mr. Reagan's campaign and later director of the CIA, briefing him about the trip in an airport lounge. Mr. Carter's camp has long suspected that Mr. Casey or someone else in Reagan's orbit sought to secretly torpedo efforts to liberate the hostages before the election. And books have been written on what came to be called the October Surprise. but congressional investigations debunked previous theories of what happened. Wow. It's almost like the congressional investigations are total BS. Wow. It's in the same way that, you had these investigations. They're like, yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald totally killed JFK by himself. There's nothing suspicious or weird at all about that, bro. Official story is the right story, bro. And, the majority of Americans don't buy it, and the majority of Americans are right. Well, same thing going on here. They debunked it. Oh, that didn't happen. How dare you? But here you have an insider coming out saying, it did happen. Mr. Connolly did not figure in those investigations. Wow, shocker. The guy who had the truth didn't figure it. His involvement, as described by Mr. Barnes, adds a new understanding to what may have happened in that hard-fought, pivotal election year. With Mr. Carter now 98 and in hospice care, Mr. Barnes said he felt compelled to come forward to correct the record. So, correcting the record, again, let's be clear here. Correcting the record is dude saying Ronald Reagan committed treason and sabotaged U.S. hostages, Americans who were terrified, thinking they'd be killed. He wanted them to stay with Iran, captured as hostages, until he wins, so that it could look like, yeah, I'm Mr. Tough Guy, I'm Mr. Strong Man, bro. That's what I am. I scare all of our enemies, bro. It was all nothing but a PR stunt. Secretly negotiating with your enemies behind the back of the White House, who was trying to secure their freedom, the hostages' freedom. That is so immensely loathsome. And remember, guys, this was like the central myth of the Reagan era. Mr. Tough Guy, Mr. Peace Through Strength, stands up to our enemies. Enemies are scared of him. It's all a farce. It's all a fraud. And now it's on the record. Now we know exactly the players who were involved. We know exactly what they were aiming for, what their motives were, why they did it. And thank God that this guy has a conscience and some shame somewhere in him, and he came forward and admitted it. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean that, did Jimmy Carter make zero mistakes? Is he now excused in every way, shape, or form? Of course not. No. I mean, that's silly, right? Domestically, we had a whole bunch of problems. You had the gas shortage. There were literally like gas lines. His domestic policy, he started ushering in the new era of neoliberalization of the economy, sort of ushering in deregulation and privatization. He wasn't really in the spirit of FDR. Foreign policy, in some ways, he was less interventionist than most presidents, but there was still, the deep state was still running roughshod all over the place and committing coups and whatnot under Carter. So I'm not saying his record was good, but the specifics of this story right here truly do paint Reagan in a devastatingly terrible light. Just a Machiavellian, treasonous little turd, weasel, in it for his own glory, and willing to screw over U.S. hostages and undermine the White House at a time when they're doing the right thing and trying to get our people freed. So, I mean, decades too late, but now we know this story is real. By the way, shout out to Tom Hartman, who's told this story before. He explained this story before. He's the one who kind of clued me into it going back maybe 5 years or so. I heard him talking about it, and I was like, really? And I wasn't sure it was true, because it seemed too absurd, right? It seemed too extreme. Like, no, Reagan wasn't a good guy, but really, that bad, really? Turns out the answer is yes. And now we know as a matter of fact. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.